Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are. In every tribe, commune, dormitory, farmhouse, barracks, and townhouse, where kids are making love, smoking dope, and loading guns, fugitives from American justice are free to go.
In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a storm brewing in America, and it didn't take a weatherman to tell. However, the U.S. was not the only country who was experiencing upheaval. It was an era of global revolution. Both peaceful and violent protests for freedom and equality ripped across the planet. Internationally, people, especially young people, were rising up against their governments in hopes of achieving true equality, wishing to liberate themselves from corrupt systems and transfer power to the people. Civil wars raged in Vietnam and Cambodia, in South America, the Middle East, and Africa. More countries seemed to be at war with themselves or each other than those who were at peace. Additionally, turmoil brewed in the West Bloc as they fought communism, whereas Britain, Germany, Japan, and the U.S. faced communist resurgence in Red Army factions. To many, it seemed as if the world was being pulled apart at its seams. All this, coupled with worldwide recession in the early 70s, made a prolific breeding ground for revolutionaries. College campuses were the first battlegrounds of the U.S. Many leftist student groups emerged, such as the Students for a Democratic Society. The SDS was a prominent group and a well-organized protest machine, at one point even taking over and effectively shutting down Columbia University for a whole week. Initially focused on civil rights for both African Americans and women, SDS soon became concerned with communist liberal values and American foreign policies. Unlike other emerging nationwide movements, the Students for a Democratic Society criticized the U.S. government as a whole, including capitalism, U.S. imperialism, and foreign and domestic oppression. As the State of the Union worsened, some members of the SDS felt the need to be more radical in their protest methods. Politicians and the public weren't listening.
After almost a decade of nonviolent actions, the Weathermen, a faction of SDS, resorted to extra-legal methods in order to undermine the American government's unethical policies. Their efforts, along with those of other radical leftist groups, effectively brought home the war, which their slogan intended, and made the U.S. public more aware of their government's crusades domestically against African American and leftist groups in Vietnam.
Some of the leaders of the Weathermen were Terry Robbins, Bernardine Dorn, and Mark Rudd, who were all powerful members of SDS at the time, branching off from their original nonviolent approach to fight U.S. exploits. The group was made of educated, privileged young white people with diverse backgrounds of movements such as for women, minority, homosexual rights, and political revolution. They had the common belief that one could either fight alongside those oppressed by the U.S., including those outside of the nation in the brewing revolution, or be alongside of the oppressor. Their issues stemmed from the fact that the wealthy U.S. was benefiting from the exploitation and oppression of other nations. The Weathermen state in their manifesto, "We are within the heartland of a worldwide monster, a country so rich from its worldwide plunder that even the crumbs doled out to the enslaved masses within its borders provide for material existence very much above the conditions of the masses of people of the world. The U.S. empire, as a worldwide system, channels wealth based upon the labor and resources of the rest of the world into the United States. The relative affluence existing in the United States is directly dependent upon the labor and natural resources of the Vietnamese, the Angolans, the Bolivians, and the rest of the peoples of the Third World." The Weathermen believed that the only way to stop the war in Vietnam would be to make it impossible for civilians and the U.S. government to ignore their protests. Terroristic attacks was their choice approach. Some may feel that they were no different than their forefathers who used similar guerrilla tactics when fighting Britain. However, the Weathermen organization never harmed anyone except themselves. In the first Weathermen communique, Bernardine Dorn exclaimed, "All over the world, people fighting American imperialism look to America's youth to use our strategic position behind enemy lines to join forces in the destruction of the empire. Black people have been fighting almost alone for years. We've known that our job is to lead white kids into armed revolution. Kids know that the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives. Tens of thousands have learned that protests and marches don't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way." In the summer of 1969, the Weathermen spread their beliefs, moving and creating communes across the country in cities like Chicago and New York, forging a network and furthering their reach. Determined to protest the Vietnam War, the first action of the Weathermen were the Days of Rage.
The Days of Rage was an attempt to break from the norms of kind of acceptable theater of here are the anti-war people, containable, marginal, predictable, and here's the little path they're going to march down.
In an attempt to bring the war home, they held a bonfire protest, then marched into downtown Chicago, causing property damage before violently confronting the local police. In every organization, from the PTA to the Third Reich, some individuals are more radical than others. One of, if not the most extreme weathermen was Terry Robbins. In March 1970, an accidentally detonated bomb killed 3 weathermen, including the bomb's creator, Terry Robbins. The bomb was intended to be set off at a dance at a local army base. This news resonated with all members of the Weathermen. The group suddenly became the target of an FBI manhunt, and members were forced to go into hiding.
Whether Hitler or Stalin or Mao, that they have a grand project for the transformation and purification of the world. And in the face of that project, ordinary life is dispensable.
The Weathermen then held a forum to discuss the extent of their violence. At this pivotal point, they decided against indiscriminately harming people. Rather, they chose to aim for 0 casualties and focus their attacks on symbolic infrastructures. They wanted to bring the war home. The Weathermen hoped their bombings would be catalysts of change, influencing the government to change their oppressive ways.
There are very few positive things to say about planting an explosive in a government building, but as an attention-getting device, it's hard to argue with the effectiveness of that bomb that went off in a third-floor washroom here at the State Department early this morning. About 20 offices, all of them empty at the time, were damaged, a few of them by the explosion itself, most of them by water leaking out of ruptured pipes.
These bombs became known as exploding press conferences, catching the public's attention at once, headlining on news networks using the media to their own resources. Having the news agencies spread their story, they sent mania and unease coursing through the public. Although the Weathermen Underground set off approximately 25 bombs, they never hurt any civilians. Using many tactics to divert any potential casualties, including bombing in the middle of the night and calling in their attacks, they were able to keep the innocent safe, at the same time destroying the U.S. institution in protest of advanced engagement in Vietnam and extra-legal killings of leaders in the civil rights movement such as Fred Hampton. Eventually, the government dedicated an entire branch of the FBI to their arrests, nicknamed the Weatherman Unit. Mark Felt, the FBI agent who headed the exposure of the Watergate scandal to the public, directed a series of break-ins into possible Weatherman hideouts, including the homes of their relatives, to gain information about future bombings and information to build a case for their arrest. Operation COINTELPRO, directed by Mark Felt, intended to neutralize any enemies of the state, all those who violated the U.S. Constitution. In doing so, he violated FBI investigation protocol on many occasions. COINTELPRO targeted new left groups and black nationalist parties, and made warrantless house searches in the homes of their targets. Bernadine Dohrn's sister, Jennifer, was subject to harassment and countless break-ins by the FBI. In an interview, she claims the FBI even had plans to kidnap her newborn son. When she received her Freedom of Information Act papers, she discovered that there had actually been developed by Felt a plan to kidnap her son after she birthed in hopes of getting her sister to surrender. Because of FBI misdeeds during their investigation, most Weathermen continued their lives without facing long-term jail time. After that, however, many Weathermen believed their jobs were finished and considered bombings trite, and came from living underground. Their repetitive blasts no longer captured the public's attention, so it was no longer worth staying underground. Eventually, most Weathermen surrendered and turned themselves into the police. Even today, former members of the Weather Underground are still playing an active role in the revolutions of the 21st century, including Mark Rudd, who is a nonviolent activist on issues of Native American land rights, U.S. military interventions, Palestine solidarity, unionization, environmental justice, and war and militarization. Still preaching against U.S. imperialism, and a college professor, Katie Boudin, who after going to prison for years became a director of Criminal Justice Initiative.
In a revolutionary context, if I didn't have my old parents and my young kids, I would certainly do it again. I would certainly want to be part of an emerging revolution again. It was a precious, precious opportunity. And I think we came close. I think the world came close to seeing those major changes, and I think that makes a difference.
When asked in an interview by PBS, did the Weather Underground really have a legacy, Bernadine Dohrn replied, "Only history can decide. I think that I don't feel like fighting for a legacy of a particular organization. We were part of a social upheaval, and it was huge, and it joined other parts of American history that until we were in it I didn't know about. You know, the abolitionist type. The various struggles in American history where people hurled themselves into resisting the law and taking the consequences of it."